Good evening, everyone. As people continue to trickle in, I'm just going to do a short introduction of who I am. My name is Katrina Hartman. I am a development officer at the Royal Alexandra Hospital Foundation, and I have the privilege of working alongside the incredible supporters of the Women's Society. It really brings me immense joy to be here before you as a member of this dynamic group. We are united by a shared commitment to the vital cause of women's health at the Lois Hospital for Women. Tonight, we have the privilege of diving into a subject of profound significance, one that touches the lives of countless women and the men in their lives too, for some. Your presence here really underscores the collective understanding of the importance of addressing issues related to women's health, and we are very grateful for you. I just want to extend a warm welcome to someone who does embody passion and dedication in our pursuit for a healthier future for women. Please join me in welcoming Becky McIntyre from the Women's Society, who will be leading the introductions this evening. Thank you again for being a part of this evening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katrina, for that welcome, and welcome to everyone else. My name is Becky McIntyre. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a proud supporter of the Lois Hospital Women's Society, and so happy to be here tonight. We have so many people that have joined us, and it's awesome for our first lecture of 2024. I'm delighted to extend a warm and heartfelt welcome to the esteemed co-chairs of the Women's Society. And we have a quick video from them to introduce this upcoming lecture and share more about the Society's deep passion for supporting women's healthcare.
Welcome to Between Us. We're so happy you're here. My name is Rhiannon Adams, and my pronouns are she, her.
My name is Vanessa Lancaster, and my pronouns are she, her. We're excited to be here as co-chairs of the Lois Hospital Women's Society. The Lois Hospital Women's Society welcomes community volunteers from all walks of life to join us as we break down barriers and raise awareness and funds for Alberta's only dedicated women's hospital. A hospital that provides such specialized care as high-risk maternal care, minimally invasive surgeries, and treatment of women's cancers.
Since our founding in 2017, the Women's Society has raised close to $1 million in support of the Lois Hospital for Women. Our hospital proudly cares for women in all ages and stages of life, from a landmass covering 1/3 of Canada, and we are proud to support it.
Your presence and support today helps make all of this possible. Thank you. Formerly known as What the Health, we debuted a new brand this year, renaming this engaging speaker series Between Us, Exploring the Mind and Body.
Most often, conversations that start with just between us come from a place of trust. This rebrand represents the essence of trust, where intimate and less openly discussed subjects like personal health matters find a safe space for discussion.
We aspire for this new name to reflect the depth of honesty, intimacy, and expert insight shared during these talks by the speakers who join us. Following the event, we'll be sending out a survey via email seeking your valuable feedback.
Every participant who completes the survey will be entered into a draw for a chance to win a $25 gift card, courtesy of Alberta Blue Cross. A heartfelt appreciation goes out to Alberta Blue Cross for their steadfast support as presenting sponsor, enabling us to host this informative series.
Please join me and Rhiannon in extending a warm welcome to Alberta Blue Cross for the land acknowledgement.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Katrina Hartman, and I am the foundation partner for the Women's Society, and I am a development officer at the Royal Alexandra Hospital, and I get to work alongside the incredible supporters of the Women's Society. So it makes me so happy to be here tonight before you as a member of this dynamic group united by a shared commitment to the vital cause of women's health at the Lois Whole Hospital for Women. Tonight, we have the privilege of diving into another subject of profound significance, one that touches the lives of so many women, all of us in the world, and the men in their lives too. Your presence here underscores the collective understanding of the importance of addressing issues related to women's health. And for that, we are very, very grateful. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to two people who embody passion and dedication in our pursuit for a healthier future for all of us. Please join me in welcoming Becky McIntyre from the Women's Society, who will be leading the introductions this evening, and Freddie Demani, our guest moderator for the Q&A portion of the evening. Freddie is our lead for stewardship and donor fulfillment at the foundation, and we are thrilled to have him here this evening. So thank you very much for being a part of this.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I don't know if you could hear it, but when things are live, sometimes you pick up things. There was an ambulance going by my window, but welcome. My name is Becky McIntyre, and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm a proud supporter of the Lois Whole Hospital's Women's Society. I'm very glad to be here. Welcome to our lecture on women's heart health. I'm delighted to extend a warm welcome and heartfelt thanks to our esteemed co-chairs of the Women's Society. They've prepared a video message to first introduce the upcoming lecture and share more about the Women's Society's deep passion for supporting women's healthcare.
Welcome to Between Us. We're so happy you're here. My name is Rhiannon Adams, and my pronouns are she, her.
My name is Vanessa Lancaster, and my pronouns are she, her. We're excited to be here as co-chairs of the Lois Whole Hospital Women's Society. The Lois Whole Hospital Women's Society welcomes community volunteers from all walks of life to join us as we break down barriers and raise awareness and funds for Alberta's only dedicated women's hospital. A hospital that provides such specialized care as high-risk maternal care, minimally invasive surgeries, and treatment of women's cancers.
Since our founding in 2017, the Women's Society has raised close to $1 million in support of the Lois Whole Hospital for Women. Our hospital proudly cares for women in all ages and stages of life, from a landmass covering a third of Canada, and we are proud to support it.
Your presence and support today helps make all of this possible. Thank you. Formerly known as What the Health, we debuted a new brand this year, renaming this engaging speaker series Between Us, Exploring the Mind and Body.
Most often, conversations that start with "just between us" come from a place of trust. This rebrand represents the essence of trust, where intimate and less openly discussed subjects like personal health matters find a safe space for discussion.
We aspire for this new name to reflect the depth of honesty, intimacy, and expert insight shared during these talks by the speakers who join us. Following the event, we'll be sending out a survey via email seeking your valuable feedback.
Every participant who completes the survey will be entered into a draw for a chance to win a $25 gift card, courtesy of Alberta Blue Cross. A heartfelt appreciation goes out to Alberta Blue Cross for their steadfast support as presenting sponsor, enabling us to host this informative series.
Please join me and Rhiannon in extending a warm welcome to Alberta Blue Cross for the land acknowledgement.
So my name is Marianne Hart, and I'm with Alberta Blue Cross. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. We're really pleased to get to sponsor this Between Us series, and especially this session. Women's health issues are obviously very important to us, and heart health is super important. For myself, heart disease runs in our family, so I'm particularly interested in today's session. As we start, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So today and every day, we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 6 territory. We recognize that the city of Edmonton and us, the people here, are the beneficiaries of this peace and friendship treaty. Treaty 6 encompasses the traditional territories of numerous Western Canada Indigenous peoples, such as the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We are taking this important moment here today to acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And now I'm going to send it back to Bethany.
Thanks so much, Marianne. I would like to introduce Dr. Norris. I have the pleasure of being able to do that today. So, did you know that heart disease is the leading cause of death for women in Canada? Statistics show that more women die from cardiovascular diseases than all cancers combined, and at least 5 times more women die from heart disease than breast cancer alone. It is time to place our focus on women's heart health. Dr. Colleen Norris is shining a spotlight on mature women's health and research, examining the health of women in the context of a multitude of factors that influence health. Dr. Norris is a registered nurse and professor in the Faculty of Nursing, and she is particularly interested in women's health research that includes the context of a woman's entire life cycle. She wants to start blending the life cycle of a woman, whether that is perimenopause, menopause, or postmenopause, with a woman's other health concerns. For too long, researchers and clinicians have ignored this connection. In her role as the Cavarzan Chair in Mature Women's Health Research, Dr. Norris works closely with Alberta Health Services, the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and the Wickery team at the Dalesford Centre for Solutions in Women's Health. In that role, Dr. Norris promotes interdisciplinary and collaborative women's health research, provides mentorship that promotes the development of junior faculty in women's research, develops collaborations in mature women's health research locally, nationally, and internationally, and acts as an ambassador and champion to actively link research with practice for the benefit of women in the communities in which they live. And because I have had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Norris speak a couple times before, I can say that she is an excellent presenter, and we are all in for an educational treat tonight. I want to pass things over to Dr. Norris, but let's see if we can get her video feed to pop up here and her presentation. And I apologize for the video issues. There we go. Okay. So Dr. Norris, even though we were having some issues with the videos, it looks like your presentation is up. So I'm very happy if you are ready, and we'll pass the reins over to you here.
Okay, I think I've got it there.
Perfect. Okay.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And it always sounds like a lot, but actually there are so many people that work in this area that we're moving fast. And I'm particularly excited about the students and in our programs that are moving this whole agenda forward. And so I'm so grateful to be here, and I would like to talk to you about the effects of sex and gender on women's heart health through the life stages. And that's sort of the new unique facet to this research. I'm just going to make sure I can move to the next slide. There we go. So I'd like to do a land acknowledgement as well. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, it's one of the books we actually use in our research programs at the University of Alberta and the Faculty of Nursing. Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer reflects on the meaning of land to the Indigenous peoples and writes, in the settler's mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything. Our identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. Our lands were where our responsibility to the world was enacted. It was sacred ground. It belonged to itself. It was a gift, not a commodity. So it could never be bought or sold. These are the meanings that people took with them when they were forced from their ancient homelands. This is a picture of Half Moon Lake in Alberta, one of the tributaries of the North Saskatchewan River. There's evidence of Indigenous people living around this area and using the waterways as the main mode of transportation for thousands of years. I am so grateful that we have the opportunity to share these ancient Indigenous lands. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we're on today. While we meet in this virtual platform, we need to take a moment to acknowledge that we're visitors on this land and the importance of the lands which we all call home. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, First Nations people that call this land home. So as I've been preparing for these talks, I was brought back to a really interesting story that was told in this wonderful book, Invisible Woman, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And it was a story about that Carolyn Criado Perez writes about the New York Philharmonic. And what was happening is that talented, qualified women and men were consistently auditioning for the orchestra, but the percentage of women in the orchestra hovered around 6%. So the concept of blind auditions was introduced, where auditions were held behind a screen. The results were so significant that the screening process continues. And today, women make up half the New York Philharmonic. And a little note on that is the original screening was not quite to the floor. And so they didn't see the results that they thought they would see. So they ended up putting the screen right to the floor because they could see the shoes of the person that was auditioning, and it ended up changing the results of who got on the orchestra. But it was written in the New York Times that blind auditions changed the face of the American orchestra. And you may be wondering, what does this have to do with women's health care? I propose it has everything to do with women's health. As I got into this and looking at the sex and gender and the literature, I was brought to an article about stereotyping that occurs, and it was actually in the management literature about hiring a person. And they give the example of the fact that the minute a person walks into a room, if you're going to be hiring them or they come in for an interview, we actually make a decision about that person almost instantaneously. And I think that's what's happening in the clinical realm as well. And I'll talk more about that as we move on. And I think it's directly affecting women's heart health. So a quick trip down my academic memory lane. I was introduced to the inequities of women's heart health while I was doing my doctoral work. So my study was looking at the differences in outcomes of men and women who went for treatment for coronary artery disease. And the coronary arteries, if you made a fist with your hand and you put your other hand on top, your other fingers would be the coronary arteries. And when someone has a heart attack, what happens is those coronary arteries get blocked. And the heart muscle doesn't get the blood and the oxygen that it requires to function, and it stops. You have a heart attack. So we were looking at the three different types of procedures in those days. And however we did the modeling, the one thing that really struck me was that I discovered that females and males were reporting statistically significant differences in outcomes, regardless of what we controlled for. And I was doing a PhD in epidemiology, and it meant that we did all sorts of modeling, and it kept coming up that the females were consistently reporting worse outcome. And we had no difficulty identifying over and over that the women presented differently, they had different treatments, but more importantly, they continue to have worse outcomes. So I was offered, I had the chance to do a postdoc, and what I decided to do is follow up on this to try and identify what was different among the women that were presenting to us. As I was doing this, I was also involved in a thing called the Genesis Praxis study. And so we started, when we were controlling for everything in that sample I was telling you about, the one thing that was something that it was so elusive, we were having trouble identifying it. I ended up calling it gender role because we had stratified by sex, which is male or female, but there was something elusive about the females that we weren't able to capture. And so I was involved in a study called Genesis, and we started to look at the gender factors of that. And we created a composite measure of gender. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. So we did produce these results, and we showed that there was something different about the females that we called gendered factors. And I was really excited about that because I thought we've identified things that we can change in our healthcare system. Whether you were a man or a woman, the females continued to report worse outcomes. But it was picked up around the world, and it wasn't picked up in a good way. As you can see from this slide, I got called from Tennessee because they wanted to do a story on their television, NBC networks, talking about the fact that housework was bad for female hearts. And that wasn't what we were trying to say. One of the measures that we measured in gender was the hours of housework you do, whether you were a man or a woman. And it was predictive of worse outcomes. So anyways, we decided to proceed, and I started to follow down this avenue of sex and gender. So how do you actually measure sex or gender? And we had clinicians telling us, I know you have to do it for research, which is now part of our role as researchers, but how is it related to clinical practice? And I even had a clinician say to me, how does the fact that someone identifies as gender fluid affect how I treat them for an MI? Well, there's a lot to unpack there, actually. But right now, we need to advance our understanding of sex and gender. And while this person was talking about gender identity, our gender analysis, it was not the only aspect that we were looking at. So the first point is that females and women are not small men. And we really need to recognize this. And the failure to recognize this has exacerbated these health disparities and inequities, and especially in women. And one of the things that I was looking at as I was preparing for this is going back to the Vitruvian man, which you see here described. And it was built to combine the principles of humanism and geometry and anatomy. And art, in fact. And the figure was reflected in the Renaissance painting that Leonardo da Vinci did. And he was studying it to identify the proportion of the human body. And this was from 1490. And actually, it's still in the galleries in the Academy of Venice and with his notes on it. But by studying the proportions of the, quote, ideal human body, Leonardo and his contemporaries actually inferred the rules. They thought they would infer the rules guiding the universe. And moreover, by applying this geometry and this knowledge of anatomy, Leonardo was taking part in an effort to elevate the status of fine arts. But this is actually the image that's associated with health, fitness, and medicine today. The idea that the male and female bodies are the same is embedded in arts and science and actually modern day medicine. So in the science of sex and gender, we'll say that every cell is sex. And I started saying, what does this actually mean that every cell is sex? Well, this might be a review for you, but it bears repeating. So your body is made up of trillions of cells, each with DNA. And the DNA is made up of thousands of genes that are wrapped into structures we call chromosomes. Every human cell, I'm going to repeat that, every single human cell has 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs, and the 23rd pair of chromosomes are called the sex chromosomes. And those are either X or Y, and men have one X and one Y, and women have two X's. More importantly, what's actually reinforced by evidence is that the genes on the X chromosome are, while they're important on how the body grows and function, they also were really evident during our COVID times because the X chromosomes are what responds to viruses. The fact that females have two X chromosomes in each cells, but the thing that we aren't taught as as we're learning biology, is that as girls are growing up, they have a mechanism that randomly turns off one of the X chromosomes in each cell. So when one of them is turned off, the others are working and it expresses different cells. So not every cell turns off the same X chromosomes. But what this means, it's called cellular mosaicism, is that females are not only more diverse than males, but also there's an incredible amount of diversity among females in general. So sex is actually defined for us as the biological construct, often understood or sometimes misunderstood as being female or male. But the important part here is sex affects the propensity for trajectories and treatments and conditions and diseases. And there's differences in drug absorption, body composition, metabolism, diseases according to your sex. We've discovered that many drugs that are on the market today were developed and tested on samples of males. And based on our sex hormones, we have different drug absorptions and different body compositions. So to be frank, aside from bikini medicine, which is treatments and drugs developed for the parts of the woman that can be covered by a bikini, we don't have evidence on how female cells or diseases of all the major organs respond to the present treatments that we have. So I was fortunate enough the other night to go to a book launch on Jen Gunther's new book called Blood. She also has written an incredible book called The Menopause Manifesto, which is written in lay language for the everyday person. But at the opening of her book is the menstrual cycle is the wheel that drives humanity. And I'm going to talk more about that because that is what biological sex is responsible for in our bodies. So the hypothalamus in the brain controls our pituitary gland, that controls the ovaries, that controls the uterus. And hormones are these chemical messengers that spread through the blood and tell the organ or tissue what it's supposed to do and at what time. And just out of interest, because I've actually been learning all this stuff again, because I knew everything there was to know about the heart, but not about women and the menstrual cycle and the life cycles. But just out of interest, the pituitary gland is this small pea-sized gland at the base of the brain, at the top of the nose, at the top of the nose. So if you went back from the top of your nose to the base of your brain, that's where this little pituitary gland, and it is our body's master gland. Now, you don't need to know anything about this further, but I just wanted to show you this because if we were looking at this from an AI perspective, this menstrual cycle that goes on in a woman from age 12 to 51, 52 years of age is this incredible biological algorithm that happens on a monthly basis. And you can see from the green arrows, it's saying if you get a rise in the GRNH or the gonadotropin hormone, it rises your follicle stimulating hormone. So all the green arrows are rises. And then when those rises get to a certain level, you see the red arrows go back and it shuts it all off till certain things happen in the ovaries and the uterus until the whole thing starts again. But you will notice in there under the ovary that estrogen is released and it keeps going up, and it helps your uterus have the proliferative phase when the lining is growing, and then it causes ovulation, and then both estrogen and progesterone are produced in the luteal phase. And if no baby, you'll see the little fetus has a cross through it happens. If no baby is implanted, progesterone actually goes down and the whole thing starts again. So that this is just to show you that this incredible thing is going on every month in our bodies, and we actually don't know a lot about it as women. So gender, just on the other hand, is a social construct, and it's developed by social sciences and referenced and described and based on your gender identity, including being man or woman. But there are other terms that we use to reference gender factors. So it's linked to power and to economics and social status, but it's very distinct from sex. And there are 4 dimensions that we use to measure in all the research that we do now. And in fact, the Tri-Council or the bodies that provide the provide us funds to do our research, we have to provide gendered measurements that we are doing in our research. And they include gender roles, like who you're married, if you're married, single, the roles that you play, are you a homemaker, a housekeeper, a mother. So those are gender roles. Gender relations are who your gender relations are with. Institutionalized gender, which is what are the institutions doing that we are responding to with behaviors that present as a gender or not. And then there's gender identity that we talked about. So this is just more examples of things that fall into those 4 gendered factors, but the things that we're collecting information on. And you say, why does that matter? Well, in that Genesis Practices study I told you about earlier, we included men and women under 55 years of age who were, and it's called early heart or premature heart attack, who were admitted to a hospital across Canada having had a heart attack or a myocardial infarction. And we collected all sorts of psychosocial gendered variables, did statistical analysis, and identified variables that were associated with outcomes. But in this, you'll see on this graph, the red line represents men, and the blue line represents women. And higher scores on our gender index were behaviors typically ascribed in our society to women. So we asked things about childcare and how many people live in your home, and do you work outside the home, and are you married? So they were, but the high score was typically ascribed, behaviors typically ascribed to women. I'm just going to go back for a minute and show you, demonstrate that you can see that the men, most of the men fell under the masculine characteristics in this study, but there were men that demonstrated female characteristics, whereas the females were more spread out throughout the whole line, throughout the whole graph with their gender index scores. So the results to me were absolutely enlightening. And just to make it simple, if we just divided the results by men and women, we found that there was no difference in the number of people coming back with a second heart attack. But when we divided it by our gender index, so high scores mean behaviors typically ascribed to females, we identified that if you had a high gender index, you were 4 times as likely to return to the hospital with a second heart attack within the first year. So there was something about those gender roles and gender relations that were causing worse outcomes in the roles that were ascribed to the female behaviors. And that was an aha moment for me, because one of the variables that was in that index was, what is your stress level at home on a scale of 1 to 10? And if you scored a 10 on that, you were 4 times as likely to return with a second heart event within the first year. And from my nursing background, I sat back and said, okay, that's something we can intervene on. We don't need a drug. We don't need a procedure. We can talk to them and say, we know if you don't get this anxiety under control, that there could be bad outcomes. So let's talk about that. Let's figure out what you need to move forward as far as your heart health is concerned. So we know that sex and gender influence our risk of developing diseases and medical treatments. And while it's important to clearly distinguish between, we also have to understand all the other intersectional and factors that are associated with sex and gender and women's heart health. So I have a short diversion, but incredibly exciting aspect. When I had the great fortune of being awarded the Cavarzan Chair in Mature Women's Health Researcher, the focus is on women's health, not just women's cardiovascular health. And as I said earlier, to be frank, all women's health research outside of bikini medicine requires that the sample or the cohort has a significant amount of women in their studies. But what we've discovered is that the research, particularly in heart health, does not have a significant number of women in the studies. It would be 30% is the highest that we found in all of the trials that are used for women's health when we're comparing them to men. But one thing I wanted to mention about this is that I put it to you that comparisons, when all of our results are always females against males, The comparison implies there's a gold standard, and every time we do studies of diagnosis or treatment or outcomes where we stratify by sex, we're reinforcing that idea that the male model is the gold standard. And in fact, we don't have evidence that any of the diagnostic methods, the treatments, or the outcomes that we already have available are actually working for women. And so the chair has allowed me to just say, I just get to study women. I don't have to have a male comparison group. So what about heart disease in Canada? Well, in 2018, the Heart and Stroke Foundation produced this seminal report, and they also had a great capital campaign that was called Seeing Red. It identified that women are underdiagnosed, undertreated, undersupported, under-researched, and underaware. And the Canadian statistics that you heard at the beginning of the hour are the same here, but heart disease is actually the leading cause of premature death for women in Canada. That's death below 55 years of age. Early heart attacks are missed in 78% of women. Every 20 minutes in Canada, a woman dies from heart disease. And you're 7 times as likely to die from heart disease as you are from breast cancer. And I'm not belittling what breast cancer is, but even if you asked me 10 years ago what I was afraid of, I would have said breast cancer. And I think we really have to make women aware of the fact that they have a risk for heart disease as well. 2/3 of heart disease clinical research focuses on men, and women who have a heart attack are more likely to die or suffer from a second heart attack compared to men. What about in Alberta? Well, in this, you might have even heard of this study because it's the 3rd year we're presenting it, but in the past 10 years in the province of Alberta, 300 women a year had an emergency room visit for chest pain or angina or discomfort, were discharged home, and subsequently admitted, having returned within 30 days with a myocardial infarction, better known as a heart attack. So they went to the emergency department, said something's wrong with my heart, and they were discharged home, and within 30 days were back having had a full-on heart attack. And this number doesn't include those who suffered a stroke or hospitalization for heart failure or who actually died following the ER visit. And it goes back to that idea I was talking about with the New York Philharmonic, is that both clinicians and women need to be aware that women present very differently. And because of the gendered aspect of it, we also use different language and describe our symptoms differently that I'm going to talk a little bit about now. The first thing is that's honestly, this has just really been making its way out since the 2018 Heart and Stroke Report, is that we have female-specific related to our sex heart diseases that are really coming to the forefront. And the picture that I'm showing you right here is the picture of your heart and the blood vessels. And you see the large vessels are the coronary arteries. And you can see all the other little vessels underneath. One of the things that we've determined is that women are more likely, and it's more common in women, to have a thing called microvascular disease. So it isn't the big arteries that are blocked or clogged with plaque. It's actually all the little vessels underneath. And that's called microvascular disease. And it's most common in women. And it's not easy to diagnose. And because the coronary cath just looks at the big arteries on the top of your heart. Females are also more likely to have a thing called coronary spasms. And that's when your arteries go into spasm. And I keep thinking of a runner or where your legs hurt when, if you've been running. What's happening is you're not getting enough oxygen and there's a buildup of lactate, but you're not getting enough oxygen to that muscle. So when a vessel spasms, it closes off, and there are times when it's not letting blood through. So it's like a plaque block, but it's intermittent, and it blocks off just by the vessel going into spasm. And the problem with that is that you have to catch the vessel spasming to actually be able to identify that that's what's going on. Females are also more likely to have a thing called spontaneous coronary artery dissection, and that's also known as SCAD. 90% of SCAD patients are women. And what it is the coronary artery on the top, the big vessel, actually just dissects or splits. as if you took a little knife and split it down, but it does it on its own and it does it spontaneously. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but we think it might have to do with, again, the estrogens and the progesterones and what they do to your vascular system. And finally, the other thing that's way more common in women is a thing called ANOCA or MANOCA, and that's ischemia with no coronary artery blockage, or myocardial infarction with no coronary artery blockage. So women will have had a heart attack, but there's no blockage. So we don't know what caused that heart attack. So the other thing that's really interesting from the gender perspective is that words really matter as far as women are concerned and their health. And I'm putting up this book that we did in our book club last month. I'm part of a book club that we're celebrating our 30th year of meeting every month, looking at different books. And we often pick up really good books like this one, The Dictionary of Lost Words, and it's about the Oxford English Dictionary and the development, but it's actually a historical fiction. So it fictionizes about a woman that actually is creating the Dictionary of Women's Words, because they aren't being included in the Oxford English Dictionary back in the 1700s. But the interesting thing that tied in for me was that these are words that women use that we need to start paying attention to, both as women and as the people who are taking care of those women. So women's symptoms occur more often when they are resting, which really throws the clinician, because you'll have heard, snow shoveling is bad for heart attacks and things where people are being really exertional. But also women tend to use words for the pain that they don't use the word pain. They'll use, I have discomfort, or it's a burning feeling in my chest. And they also show up in the ER after the heart event has occurred. One reason is because some of these signs and symptoms are quite innocuous, but the other thing is women will tend to say, I just want to pick up my kids before I take care of this, or I just need to make sure that, there's food on the table before I contact a doctor or talk to my friend that something's wrong. And so women absolutely downplay their symptoms. So the most common signs and symptoms are a heart attack, is still chest pain, pressure, discomfort of some kind. And it's not always severe, and it's not always even the most prominent symptom in women. What's different in women is that they are consistently have 3 or more symptoms at the same time that you kind of might not place along with having a heart attack. So the shortness of breath, or nausea and vomiting, or sweating, lightheadedness or dizziness, or unusual fatigue. So unusual fatigue they did a study where they asked women who'd had a heart attack, symptoms that they had before they had their heart attack. And 70% of those women identified they had unusual fatigue. And this is the type of fatigue where you have to sit down when you're making the bed. It isn't, as I've said before, we're all tired and we're always tired, but this is that kind of, I got to sit down because I don't feel like I can stand up to finish making the bed. So the other thing that I'd like you to think about when you're looking at all of these symptoms is, if I'm in the emergency department and a woman walks in between 35 and 45 years of age, or 50 years of age, and she starts describing all these symptoms, the first thing I think my head is going to go to is she's perimenopausal, because these are also signs and symptoms of perimenopause. The lightheadedness, the sweating, the fatigue, the shortness of breath, the weight gain. And so that's where some of the confusion absolutely arises. So back to this idea that women are not simply smaller men, as the prevailing medical wisdom used to be. But I was fortunate to do an opinion in the Edmonton Journal, and I can get them to put the connection in the chat box. But what we were looking at is, what we were arguing in the paper was that we need to recognize the differences that are associated with a female's life cycle. And this was a beautiful piece of art that one of our Bachelor of Nursing students drew for us when we had our big Wear Red Canada Galentine's night the other night, and we're going to do it annually. It was such a huge success. But what you can identify in this is that at each of the stages, there are things that we have identified in women's heart health that are absolutely related to premature heart disease. They increase your risk if you had them. And I'm not telling you this to try and scare you. I just think women need to be aware that things like getting your period before 11 years of age or after 14 years of age, or being on contraceptives for a really long, birth control pills for a really long period of time. There's a lot of girls that are put on them for acne, and that's not what they're for. And we need to start thinking about that. If you had complications of pregnancy, like gestational diabetes or hypertension. When I went to nursing school, if you had gestational diabetes or diabetes while you were pregnant, we would say to the mom, don't worry about it. When the baby's born, you're good to go, nothing. But we now know that that's not the truth, that there are issues with your vascular system that occur. And it goes all the way around. Infertility or depression and extraordinary anxiety are also precursors or risks, make females more at risk for early heart disease. So here is a map that, or a graph that was created to talk about potential cardiovascular risk factors through the ages. I'm going to go back one more. As you get older, and it's some of the things I talked about, but they're really things that we're starting to get looking into. And I think what we really need to do is not look at a woman is a woman is a woman. We have to figure out what life stage the woman is in and make sure we do a thorough assessment of these factors that we know are affecting your heart health. And, you know, I repeat myself, but one of the things that I've always been asked whenever I used to go into see a healthcare professional is, when was your last menstrual period? And that's to determine if you could be pregnant or not. And then they stop asking that question. And no one is really asking women the questions that we need for them to ask in order to make sure that we're taking care of women's health. So just as I was going through to get ready for this, I came across some incredible TEDx, and these are TED Talks, which are on video, and you can find them on YouTube. And this one was the surprising link between women's brains and the birth control pill. And I was looking at this because it just is, it's a wonderful form of controlling births. And the interesting thing that Sarah Hill talked about at the beginning is talking about the birth control pill violates two rules of feminism. And one of them is that women are very protective of the birth control pill because it actually allowed women to regulate their fertility and plan. And it was responsible so they could advance and have some financial independence. So questioning whether what we're doing with the birth control pill actually scares people. The other thing is we cannot talk about sex hormone involvement in the brain because we think it's just related to your hormones. It's not related to your brain. And there's this sexist rhetoric that cyclically changing hormones make females irrational. And she goes on to describe that our cycles are not unpredictable. The first half of the cycle, we have high levels of estrogens. The second half of the cycle, you have high levels of progesterone. And she makes the joke that males, on the other hand, who have testosterone, fluctuates by age, time of day, and a whole bunch of other things, she quotes. And if anybody has capricious hormones, it's men, it's not women. And women and men's hormones affect how we think, feel, and behave. And we're not talking about them. And the fact that everyone is going on birth control pills is not good for women's health. And even though women take the birth control pill for a small number of targeted effects, it does have an impact from head to toe. And the way that birth control pills work is it changes women's levels of our sex hormones. And they're actually a key part of the signaling machinery that I showed you at the beginning that our brain uses to create the experience of who we are. So when we change those sex hormones, we're actually changing the version of our brains. And there's a growing body of literature in psychology and neuroscience that say that women's own levels of estrogen actually predict who we are attracted to, our testosterone preference. So the other thing that's important here is a stress response. So any stressor, whether it's physical or emotional or mental, causes it within 5 minutes, cortisol is released, which is another hormone. And cortisol helps us to get ready for what we call fight or flight. So it's a stress and your body says something's coming at you. And what it does, it dumps fats and sugars into our bloodstream and it primes our brain to learn and our memory so that if this happens again, we're better able to cope. And there's a whole body of research of how important cortisol is. But it causes problems with emotional regulation and it impairs learning and memory. So it's not just the individual woman that's changed, but every time that stress is released, it also affects our level of estrogen. And we just need more conversations about that. So the other incredible TED Talk that I was able to watch was The Surprising Truth About Making Babies, because one of the things that we know can elevate your risk of cardiovascular disease is infertility. And she was talking about, we should be talking about and teaching fertility in adolescence. We teach girls how not to get pregnant, but we also should be talking to girls about how to get pregnant. And her point was, we should all understand the menstrual cycle in order for us to truly take care of our bodies and be independent in what we decide. And she said that one of the things she said, and I've actually seen it in the Twitterverse in the last couple of days, is this idea about if you look at the gumball machine, that the machine is the ovaries and the gumballs are the number of eggs a woman is born with. And as she gets older, the gumballs that are left start to get stale. And by 40, that supply is getting low. And by 44, any stragglers are well past her prime. That's her words. And she says, your eggs don't subscribe to the model of 40 years is the new 30 years. And IVF does increase your body with hormones to fertilize the sperm. And women take a hormone prep in this. And it's just important that we pay attention to, again, what it's doing to the cycle and how it's working within our health. So the last thing I want to talk about as far as the cycle is concerned, that is in perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause. And the one thing that I've really learned as I'm getting into the research, mature women's health research, is this idea that, you know, in society, we think, bang, you're either menopause or you're postmenopausal. And so it means the average age is 51. So when you're 40 or 50.9999, you're premenopausal, and then after that you're menopausal. And it isn't divided like that, and we all know that. And the issue is that it's called a menopausal transition now. And we have identified that a lot of the symptoms that women describe in perimenopause, which can be 15 years pre hitting your menopause, the 12 months without hitting menopause, which is defined as 12 months without a period, that the hot flashes and night sweats are now described as vascular symptoms. So we know from the literature from way back that as estrogen drops off after menopause, your ovaries aren't producing it the way they used to. What happens is all of the wonderful effects that estrogen had on our vascular system are lost. And I mentioned that, you know, the students that are working on this, and we actually have a PhD student, Nicole Tague, who's working on this for her PhD. And we started thinking that, you know, we know what happens to women after menopause, but let's take a few steps back and think about women who lose their period for a length of time. And amenorrhea is described as a lost period for 3 months or greater. And we all know that athletes and runners and people who diet have lost their period for a period of time, no pun intended. And we are starting to say, we always used to say to women, don't worry about it, your period will come back. But now that athletes, high-level athletes, are starting to have complications of pregnancy, as well as having trouble getting pregnant, we're saying we need to take a step back and say, when you lose your period for 3 months, it's doing something to your vascular system. And we need to identify what that is. And I'm kind of amazed that we've never talked about this, and it's never been brought up as far as health is concerned. And one of the studies that was pulled, that one of my students identified to me, was looking at women postmenopausal, so no estrogen. One group, they both exercised, and one group also got extra estrogen while they were exercising. And the group that just exercised, no advantage to doing the exercise at all. The group that had estrogen along with the exercise showed improvements in all of their outcomes that were being measured. And the first thought I thought is, I'm just shocked that the Olympians haven't discovered this yet, that actually if you have a high-level athlete and you give them some estrogen, they might actually perform better, but that's another story. So I just want to talk a bit of the other things that we're doing because it applies to all of you who are listening tonight. So I was fortunate enough to be one of the founding members of Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance. If you look that up, it's online, and it is a group of over 300 members right now, and clinicians and healthcare providers of every discipline, and lots of women with lived experience that inform us about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And one of the first things we did was we created a thing called the Atlas of Women's Heart Health. And this atlas is available to everyone. I'm just going to flip over, and it's called the Canadian Women's Heart Health Atlas, and it's on CJC, Canadian Journal of Cardiology Open. The reason I'm mentioning it to you is because it has all of the information that we've identified, sex and gender factors and all of that, if you're interested in reading the science. But chapter 3 of this atlas was written by our patient partners, and they labeled it Stopped at the Gate. And they talk about the symptoms and the advocacy that they're trying to do to help women move forward as far as their heart health is concerned. This is the reason, again, I'm mentioning it, is because it's open for anybody to read. That's one of the wonderful things about the new open access journals. And this is just where you can find it on CJC Opened. And we've been focusing on helping clinicians, but this actually is for women as well, to be able to read and learn more about what the evidence is and what more we need to know. The other thing that's just coming out in March is a whole issue, again, on the Canadian Journal of Cardiology Open, called Why Her Heart Matters, Evidence-Based Practice and Practice-Based Evidence, that I was fortunate enough to edit. We have 33 different manuscripts on all sorts of different things, and I've highlighted the one that I was involved with, which is women's heart health and the menopausal transition, two faces of the same coin. And each of them has this plain language summary that you could just review and see, and it's so helpful for women to know about this stuff, so that there's an article on PCOS, there's an article on SCAD that I was talking to you about. Any of these things that we've been talking about tonight, we actually have an article about where the evidence is and where we need to go. So that's open to the public as well. The other thing on the advocacy front is I do a thing called, well, we do it across Canada, Wear Red Canada Day. We just celebrated it. It was February 13th. And we do it annually. It was our 5th year to raise awareness about women's heart health. And it's for everybody, and you can get involved in activities, and there's lectures, and there's all sorts of fun things. And the thing we did this year for the first time, and it was so much fun. I have very young women that are part of the committee that helped organize it. And one of them, our colleague Jack Kitson, had said, what about Galentine's Day? Because apparently February 13th in one of the TV shows, Community whatever, created this thing called Galentine's Day. And it was the idea of women getting together the day before Valentine's Day. And so we had our Galentine's Day gala. And it was just to share about women's heart health, and we had a psychologist talk about, what the gendered factors and what's going through your head, and how we really do have to take care of ourselves. And that's what the message is tonight. Learn about your bodies, take care of your bodies. And then we also had someone talking about advocacy, and how do you talk to a doctor, or how do you say, I think it's my heart, and not get sent away. So all sorts of things like that. And we're going to do it again next year. So that's why the big promo for it. The other thing too that I wanted to mention through the Cavarzan Chair in Mature Women's Health Research, we've actually launched 2 studies to enable us to start to collect the data that we need to progress in women's health. So all of the data that I've been talking to you about, when did your period start? What was your period like? How long did it last? Were you on birth control? Did you have complications of pregnancy? All of those, wherever you are at in your life, we actually need to start collecting that data because we don't have it. We've got some older studies that took a big cohort of women and said, we're looking back and saying, yeah, there is an association between, say, you know, complication of pregnancy and early heart disease. But we don't have it right at our fingertips. And one of the other things we're doing in the menopause transition care study is that we're going to start looking at different methods to control the symptoms that aren't necessarily related to drugs and procedures, but they're methods that have been proven through clinical trials in other areas. One example is music therapy for sleeping, and we have a student at the university who's doing her PhD who's looking at this with one of my colleagues, and you know, they give you different tones and then you determine which tone suits you best, and you go through a session of learning how to use music to help you sleep. And women who are perimenopausal will always say that, or consistently say that they're having trouble sleeping if you ask any woman who's in perimenopause. And one of the things that really bothered me as I started to hear more and more of this is that we always say, the response to women who say, I get 4 hours of sleep a night is that that's normal. It'll come back to you. Don't worry about it. And while I was really getting into this literature last year, I was also reading a book called Why We Sleep by an incredible neurologist, a neuroscientist. And he was saying that there's a direct relationship between sleep deprivation and dementia. And I had just heard the statistics that 2/3 of the people with dementia in Canada are females. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, that's because they didn't sleep postpartum and they didn't sleep during perimenopause. And we said it was normal, and it's not. So we need to collect all this data so we can start making changes and making them right now. This is the sort of questions that we're asking, and they're related to the sex and gender factors that I've been talking to you about tonight. But it's also, they're related to our health outcomes, not just heart outcomes, but also health outcomes. And it takes about 15 minutes for the survey to be completed. And then at the end, we actually, this is a shameless plug, we ask women if they'd like to be involved in future research so that we would be able to contact them for any of these other studies that we're looking at. Another one is that we're looking at addressing is women in perimenopause start to put on weight, abdominal weight specifically. And I remember it well, my clothes just started getting tighter. And, you know, we say, well, you have to be physically active, but maybe you really aren't keen on running, or especially in Edmonton, walking outside or doing anything outside. And we have one of our colleagues in kinesiology, the Faculty of Kinesiology, who does dance therapy. And she's got a proven evidence-based study that shows that dance and teaching dance for a certain period of time, over a length of time, improves the physical outcomes of women who take the dances. So those are the things we're looking for. So in particular, like I said, if this is something that you could fill out the survey for us, we would just love it. And in the meantime, I want to thank you for all your attention and indulging me over reflecting about women's heart health. And I really want to thank WICRI and the Alberta Women's Health Foundation and the Lois Whole Hospital Foundation for Women and the Royal Alec Hospital Foundation. They've all been so supportive in getting the word out and getting all of these studies underway. We have a beautiful facility over at the Lois Whole Hospital for Women and the Dale Sheard Centre for Discovery, and where we're ready, willing, and able to start really moving forward on this. And it couldn't have happened without all of the support of the people. And one more thing I have is, if you want to contact us about anything, our email is wohealth@ualberta.ca, and we would love to hear from you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Norris, for that excellent presentation. We're getting a lot of comments noting that people could listen to you for hours. So excellent job. And of course, a very, very important topic. There are a few questions, which I'll get into right now. But before we get into the questions about the topic, there's quite a few questions about the survey you mentioned at the end of the presentation and how people can access that. Yeah.
So that survey, the slide I had actually has the QR code that you actually will take you right into the survey. And I don't know how we get it to people, but I'm happy to share that maybe with the group, and you could send it out to anyone's email. And then you just take a picture of the QR code, if that works.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who are asking, we will send a recording of this presentation out next week. So you will have access to that QR code as well.
And I actually tried it on the slideshow. I took a picture and it took me right into the survey. So it actually does work if you just put your phone up to the QR code.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to jump into the questions about the topic itself. First, we have a question asking, do postmenopausal women in their late 50s who have low hormonal profiles have a higher incidence of heart disease?
So that's the article I was talking about, the menopausal transition and women's heart disease, two faces of the same coin, because we've been bad in the heart health community about hormones because of the studies that came out in the late 70s and 80s that were identified that, women who took hormones were at greater risk for breast cancer and for heart disease. And in fact, that article talks about how all of those results were really misinterpreted. And one of the big things about that was that the women who were in that study were 63, average age was 63 years of age. And since that time, there has been a thing called the timing hypothesis that has been identified. And the timing hypothesis is it matters when you start the hormone replacement therapy if you have low hormones. If you're 50 and you haven't hit menopause yet, then it's an ideal time to talk to somebody about the new biosynthetic hormones. So I'm going to get back to the timing hypothesis. So when they divided the sample by older women and younger women, but it was women closer to menopause and ones that were 10 or more years out. The women who were 10 or more years out, what happens is when your ovaries start producing estrogens, that you actually, those receptors that used to grab onto the estrogen for your vascular system, they have actually died off. And there are issues with pounding your system with estrogen when you don't have the receptors to make use of them. And so if you're 10 or more years past menopause, then yes, if you started taking hormone replacement therapy, there would be issues with heart disease, worse heart disease, and with potentially breast cancer. In the younger women in that cohort, it was actually found that if they were on some kind of hormone replacement therapy, it was protective. And one of the things, and I'm not an expert on this at all, because I've just been really reading about, because as I said, I've always been in the heart world, but I've been really reading about women's cycles and the biosynthetics and all of the stuff that's come forward since those days where it was actually horse urine estrogen that the women were given. And one of the things that has been that I've really noticed in all of the literature is what happens, why women get these awful symptoms in perimenopause is because of the ups and downs, the crazy shoots of estrogen and progesterone, because our system is slowing down and shutting down as far as estrogen and progesterone are concerned. And the message is saying, okay, these ovaries aren't ready to produce an egg every month, like the gumball analogy was. They aren't good at producing an egg. So the issue with getting on the new biosynthetics, which absolutely replicate our body, are two things: is that you can get on them in Edmonton, but you have to go to a private clinic. It's not covered right now. We don't have that service offered for women in general. There are private clinics that do it, but one of the things they do is it's small amounts of estrogen and progesterone, and they monitor your blood estrogen and progesterone levels so that we make sure we aren't giving you too much. And so that in the old days, it was a one size fits all too. Every person in the study got the same amount of estrogen, and it was too much. So we've come a long way with it. It's just not part of our public system right now. And as I said, there are many really good private systems that are doing it. And what we're doing is by collecting all this data, we're saying this is something that is integral to women's health and that we need to start. It needs to become part of the public system.
Thank you. There's a follow-up to that question, part two. Do bioidentical hormones change the incidence of heart disease in women or impact it in any way?
We don't know because we don't have the evidence on that, right? And honestly, I've talked to women who don't tell their physician that they're on the bioidenticals because they're afraid of what their physician is going to say to them. So we're not having these conversations with our clinicians at all. And I've had women that say they asked their clinician about it, and the clinician said, if you want to get that, you have to go to someone else. And I also had a woman who had a heart attack and had been on them and came back, told me that she would rather have another heart attack than to be going through the symptoms that she was going through because she was told she couldn't have them anymore. And so I ended up referring her to one of these clinics that are run by, there's a lot of them that are run by NPs, nurse practitioners, and they have PhDs and they know what they're doing and they've done all the coursework, and they're able to help you with those answers, because I don't think it's black and white. It never will be, and it has to be individualized. It has to be who you are sitting in front of me and what are your risks and what do we need to do about that.
Thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee from BC. Are you aware of any treatment for AFib for women, or is it the same as treatment for men, particularly anti-arrhythmia?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the treatments that are used for women are the ones in Canada that have been determined to be used for both men and women. And what I'm saying there is the way medicine works is that the Canadian Cardiovascular Society gets together and they work on these clinical guidelines. And what clinical guidelines are saying do is they look at all of the evidence and they determine what is the best treatment for AFib or for valve disease or heart disease. The issue with all of those trials is that we've started to look at them. We started this a couple of years ago where we pull all the trials that were used for the clinical practice guidelines and we look at the number of women in the trials. And there are some trials that were used in the clinical practice guidelines where there were no females in the trial. And so by our pointing this out, by our publishing this, that there were, these were the trials that were used and this with the number of women in it, we've actually started to see a shift where they're looking at all of the data stratified by sex. And you may not have enough women to make a statistical conclusion, but you can actually look at how the women reacted to the drug and how they didn't. So that's a long-winded story, a long-winded answer to say we have treatments that work for atrial fibrillation, but I'm not convinced that they were studied in enough women that we can say they work for women necessarily.
Thank you. We also have a question from Allison. How reliable is the stress test in identifying heart problems in women?
So the word on the street was that a third of the women who took a stress test would show a false negative. So a stress test, you get on a treadmill and they monitor your heart while you're on the treadmill and they keep raising it up and making it more difficult and making it faster. So you're really working. And you remember I said that women are more likely to have heart issues when they're resting, not on exertion. So the stress test has been identified to identify women that have blockages in their heart as the most likely reason for them being stressed. So it's a really important test still, and it does give us some answers, but it can't be a yes or no that you have heart disease or not after the stress test.
Thank you. We have a question, a few of them actually, talking about autoimmune disease and how much it's related to heart health. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, so there's a whole branch of, same as there's now cardio oncology. So I have a colleague that's looking at, who does cardio oncology research work, and she actually is a nurse practitioner that got her PhD, Dr. Edith Petushkin, who does breast cancer care of women over at the Cross. And she was the first to tell me that breast cancer is actually a chronic disease now, because they've developed the drugs and the procedures that are helping women live longer. It's not the death sentence that it was. She also told me that women, and this is by the evidence, it's also true that women with breast cancer are more likely to die of heart disease. And there's some of the treatments for breast cancer therapy and some of the, and radiation to the left breast can injure your heart. And the good news is there are lots of research going on in that area, and Edie is actually looking at putting people on heart medications before they start their breast cancer treatments and showing better outcomes. But as far as the autoimmune disease, it's exactly the same. It's sort of, to me, it's like 5 years behind the cardio-oncology. We're now doing cardio-immunology, looking at the fact that there's so many women who have heart disease, but also have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus and other things that's related to the immune system. And the immune system is on the X chromosome, so it's not surprising. The immune system response is based in the X chromosome, so it's not unusual that women are more likely to have immune response issues. There is research going on, and there actually one of the chapters talks about it on our atlas on Canadian Journal of Cardiology Open. It's specifically about the rheumatic diseases, autoimmune diseases, and heart disease in women.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question from Dale asking if there's a type of test to produce a snapshot picture of the heart's small blood webbing to compare in the future or be used as a screening tool.
Yeah, I love that question. We have tests right now that are called provocative tests, and until very recently, we didn't have them here in Edmonton at all. And it's a test that's done while you're doing a cardiac cath. They actually can take a picture when they're doing the provocative test. I don't know that it takes a picture, but it measures the functional aspects of the microvasculature and tells us what we need to know about microvascular disease. There are not tests that I know right now that take pictures of the microvasculature. And you saw how small it is in that picture. So it would be really difficult to know if there was even a blockage in it. The provocative test actually causes your vessels to react to a drug, and it will tell us if the microvasculature is blocked based on the test. And as I said, they've started to do it at the Mazankowski. They bought the machine to do it, and it's just recently that we're even able to do it for women in Edmonton.
Thank you. We also have a specific question. Is hypertension a type of heart disease, or is it simply a risk factor for heart disease?
What a good question. So hypertension is high blood pressure, and it's a risk factor for heart disease. But hypertension is also directly related to your estrogen and your progesterone levels in women, because estrogen keeps the vessels pliable, and it also is related to your kidneys and causes all sorts of things to happen in your body if you haven't got enough blood in your system, and it causes your blood pressure to go up, or if it's too high and it releases it. Those are all related to estrogen. So there is some connection as well. So it is a risk factor for heart disease. We do know that, but I'm starting to think we need to pay more attention to not just that a woman has hypertension, but what is their hormonal status at this time when we're talking about the hypertension.
Thank you. Related to risk factors, we have a question noting that if you know you have a lot of risk factors, what can be done proactively?
So, you know, if I even went on, American Heart Association put out a guidelines for women and heart disease, because it's Wear Red month in the United States as well. And they talk about the risk factors that we all know about. And those we all can control. So it's smoking and high blood pressure. And actually, smoking and high blood pressure are, when the two are combined, they're worse for females. They cause a greater risk for females than males. It's diet, it's exercise, so it's not eating processed foods. We have to go back to the natural foods and cutting your vegetables and eating more fruits and vegetables and that sort of thing. And if you go on the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance, a website, just Google Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance, and it has so many resources for all of this, for diet, for exercise, for smoking. Those risk factors, there's something we can do something about. I worry more when I talk about this and I say about early menarche or late menarche or complications of pregnancy. At our gala, we had little jars and we asked people to put in a little heart if they had any one of these, all of these different risks that are based on your life stage, and those jars filled up. And so a lot of women have one or many of these. What we need to do is we need to have women telling their clinician, I was told that gestational diabetes or hypertension in pregnancy or preeclampsia is related to early heart disease. What are our plans for me going forward? Because we can attenuate those risks by making sure that your vascular system is working properly.
Excellent. Thank you. We're getting quite a lot of questions about the role of mental health in the development and management, right, of heart disease in women. Can you shed a little bit of light on that, specifically about how it's addressed in treatment?
Oh, it's so sad when I see this, and I even had a slide because stress is the stress response, as I said, causes cortisol to go up and it alters our estrogen levels. And there's all sorts of things that happen when we're stressed out that actually can make heart disease worse. The other thing that is combined with this is sort of this chicken and the egg. If you have heart-related symptoms and you go in and you're told that it's anxiety or stress, that actually increases your anxiety or stress. It doesn't help for them to label it as anxiety or stress, and it doesn't help with the pains that you're feeling. So, and we also know that women who have had a heart event are 4 times as likely to report clinical depression after that heart event. So the whole thing about mental health is that we need to recognize that it's related to heart disease. It's also related to women's health. And it's not good enough to be told, you're anxious and you need to calm down. One of the things we were talking about with advocacy is saying, okay, I get it. I'm very anxious and I need to calm down. What are your suggestions here? Like, I need some help from you. Is it that you can give me a referral to a psychologist? Do I need to talk to a social worker? What are the other things that are available to me for me to deal with this? And the other thing too is we did a study way back and we were looking at women who we screened for depression in the old days in a huge registry we had on everybody who had a heart test for heart disease in the province of Alberta. And so everybody who screened high for anxiety or depression, we did a little clinical trial and we sent them a letter saying, you screened high and you should probably see somebody. And here are the people that are available to you in the city of Edmonton. And the second group, we actually called and talked to them. And the third one, we sent them literature. So the control group was the people that we just said, you screened high and here's who you should contact. And honestly, I did some of the phone calls and I would say, I'm phoning to talk to you about screening high. You screened high for depressive symptomatology. And I just wanted to tell you that this is really normal after you've had a heart event. And you could honestly hear the sigh, oh my God, at the other end of the phone, because people are saying, geez, I survived a heart attack and here I'm feeling like I don't want to get out of bed and everything is wrong. So just even talking to them we repeated the measures afterward, increased it exponentially, just talking to someone. And so we may not have, that's another thing that we talk about in women's heart health is that early on, another thing that we discovered is as far as relationships are concerned, women do better. The female patients did better if they had a wife or a friend or a daughter that they could get their social support from. Men did better if they had a wife. So we started talking about your posse and your friends and talking to your friends about this and getting your friends to help you and support you. And that includes getting your friend to come in with you to the doctor's appointment so that they're helping you hear what the doctor is saying, but they also can ask questions, and it's not you that's being forced to say, look, I don't understand what you're saying. So, but also about mental health, like talk to your friends about it and say, I'm thinking I need some help. And if we all start doing this, there'll be, I think exponentially it'll grow that we can start to help people by helping each other.
Excellent. We're just getting close to the wrap-up time here. We've got so many questions. For those of you which we haven't addressed your question, we'll do our best to answer them in follow-up questions. But we're getting quite a few questions around the steps women can take to better advocate for their heart health and ensure they're receiving the appropriate care. I know that's a very loaded question. What are your thoughts on that?
I had a student that created little cards that we produced a couple of years ago. And the way you advocate for your heart health is you know what your risks are. And that includes, those aren't just the traditional risks, that includes the female specific risks. And then you start to talk to your clinician about that and say, I'm concerned. And if the one thing about the symptoms that I don't know if I mentioned is that they're all happening at the same time. It isn't that, 1 week you're tired and then the next week you might feel the shoulder pain. They're actually happening at the same time if we pay attention to it. And so if you go in, you have to say, I really think it's my heart. And if they say, well, we don't think it is, I said, well, or we've done the test, we did an ECG and it doesn't show that it's your heart. And you say, well, what happens? What do I do when this happens again? Like, what am I supposed to do? We really have to advocate for ourselves. And again, the other thing that we can do is in advocating for yourself is the language you use when you go in to see your clinician. Please, please, please don't say it's discomfort or it's just sort of a burning. If it's a pain, it's a pain. And that's the word that people have to hear. And just a final thing is one of the nurses that take emergency nurses, I took my mom in to the emergency and I was talking to the emergency nurse about women's heart health. And she said to me, if in the triage, if a woman doesn't use the word pain, if they say, well, I have this chest discomfort and I'm kind of short of breath, if they don't use the word pain, they don't go into the chest pain protocol. So they will not be tested necessarily for heart issues. So you really have to be specific about your language in the clinical environment today.
So thank you for that very helpful information. We've run out of time for questions. As mentioned, we will do our best to answer them in our follow-up communications, but I want to thank you again, Dr. Norris, for sharing your insights and knowledge. Very engaging presentation, and you can see by the questions and the continued comments that they'd love to listen to you for hours, including myself. It's been great. Thank you very much from all of us and the attendees as well.
Thank you so much for listening.
I want to say, take this opportunity to say thank you from the bottom of my heart and all of the hearts of everyone here today for all of the attendees who have taken part in this evening and continue to make this event and online community so amazing. I think we learned so much today, and we're again thankful for Dr. Norris's time. Again, for those of you who registered, we will be sharing a recording of this presentation early next week, so do stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you would like to support the Women's Society and be a part of this dynamic group, we'd love for you to consider becoming an active monthly donor. You should see a QR code on the screen that I've shared here. Feel free to scan it using your mobile device. That will bring you directly to the Lois Whole Hospital Women's Society website. If you would like the URL, it is lhhwomensociety.com. And there you can sign up to learn more about the mission, accomplishments, and of course, stay tuned for upcoming events. If you have any questions about signing up or donating, feel free to reach out to Katrina Hartman. And again, a very special thank you to all of you who donated already during the registration process and the individuals and businesses who support monthly and continue to be active monthly supporters of the Lois Whole Women's Society. As mentioned, there's still time to donate. Please do visit our website. And last but not least, a huge thank you to Alberta Blue Cross for sponsoring our Between Us talks and making these talks possible. You can see with some of the engagement today how important these talks are, so thank you so much. And of course, this marks the end of our webinar. Do not forget, a feedback survey will be sent to you shortly, and if you fill it in, you'll be entered into a draw to win a $25 gift card courtesy of our friends and sponsors at Alberta Blue Cross. The winner will be contacted directly by a representative. Of course, stay tuned for our next talk, which will be held on March 21st. Thank you again. We'll see you next time, and everyone have a wonderful and safe evening.